Yeah, it's not the when greed takes over.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm kind of thumbing through it. Okay, thank you very much. I love stories like that. Yeah.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Patricia Droz, and I'm the director of the Distinguished Scholars Program here at UC Christian High School. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to the Scholars Presentations, the Scholar Class of 2021. What you're going to see tonight really represents a couple different fields, disciplines of academic work. Christian Gwali and Emily Mallon are doing work in the social sciences, and so they're going to do a pretty typical presentation. Matthew Lollinger is going to be doing a humanities-style presentation, which is the delivery of a paper. So you'll notice there are stylistic differences. We're trying to enact the rules, the conventions of the genres of the disciplines here in DSP, and so you're going to see some of that tonight. What you're going to see tonight would not be possible at all if it weren't for the many contributions of several different people. Mentors who help the scholars on their papers, the administration, the facilities folks who set up tables, the tech desk, folks like Calvin over here who make sure that that live stream goes out. So if you are one of these people, I want to just ask you to stand up so we can recognize you, family, friends, for the work that you've helped put together tonight. So please, please, let us salute you. Come on, stand up. You're being told. Thank you, Dr. McClain. Very instrumental in helping Dr. Donovan. So thank you very much. Okay. So with that said, I'm going to welcome to the stage tonight's MCs.
Hello, my name is Robert Pounds and I am a member of the Scholar Class of 2022.
And I'm Jonathan Chen, the other member of the Scholar Class of 2022.
So we're honored to be your MCs for tonight. And thank you all for coming out, really. Tonight you are going to see the culmination of the last year's worth of effort and research on the seniors' part. And I say the last year, but it's really the last 4 years, over all 4 years of the Distinguished Scholars Program. And it is all led up to this night, to this presentation of their findings.
During freshman year, DSP scholars are introduced to writing and researching and presenting in the APA style. Sophomore year, they consolidate these skills by preparing a short literature review and presenting their findings to their classmates. Then in junior year, which is where Robert and I are at in the process, is when scholars finally begin the research projects that will ultimately become the presentations you'll be seeing tonight. So in junior year, DSP scholars settle on a topic, and because they're going to be studying this topic throughout junior and senior year, hopefully that choice is not one that they will come to regret.
So after choosing a topic, we made an annotated bibliography and turned that into a synthesis matrix. And that allowed us to clearly organize our thoughts and all of our resources, and that's made it much, much easier to really start to construct our literature reviews. So our literature reviews, we're trying to find everything that we can that's currently on the field of our specific area of research, and then that will translate into next year where we will pick a gap somewhere in that research and see if we can't try to fill in that gap with our own original research.
So more specifically, my own literature review has focused on metabolic syndrome and the microbiome. So many different sources define metabolic syndrome as a constellation of cardiovascular disease risk factors, which is an image that I really like because it captures both the complexity and scale of metabolic syndrome. Officially, this condition consists of 6 different factors: atherogenic dyslipidemia, abdominal obesity, raised blood pressure, insulin resistance, prophylaxis state, and pro-inflammatory state. While diagnosis with metabolic syndrome doesn't require having all 6 of these factors, each additional one that a patient has increases their risk for cardiovascular disease. One of the possible factors influencing the development of metabolic syndrome is the microbiome, which is all the bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protists that live in or on the human body. And because the average person's microbiome actually outnumbers their human cells, the microbiome plays a tremendously important role in maintaining human health. A lot of this role is carried out in the gastrointestinal system with the various metabolic processes that the microbiome carries out. Because the microbiome's composition is so heavily influenced by environmental factors like antibiotics and stress, doctors are coming to believe that the microbiome might be a way that we can treat diseases like Alzheimer's and obesity in the future. Therefore, in my literature review, I have looked at the different definitions of metabolic syndrome and the biological processes behind each of those components. And to complete my literature review, I am continuing on to examine how the microbiome interacts with each of those components of metabolic syndrome.
So, as I'm sure all of us know, teen vaping is on the rise, and it's a pretty big issue. So at the beginning of this school year, I set out to answer the question, what harmful effects does e-cigarette use, specifically the ingestion of nicotine and other harmful inhalants found within e-cigarettes, on adolescents' respiratory health and brain function? So my findings, to me at least, have been fascinating and quite frightening in a lot of cases. E-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury, it's called EVALI because it's much shorter and easier to remember, is just a blanket term for a lot of the different diseases that can be caused by the components of e-cigarettes and the inhalation of them. And a lot of the things in e-cigarettes can cause EVALI, such as the 3 main compounds used to flavor them, also the 2 compounds that are generally used as the base of the actual liquid. But in addition to causing EVALI, those break down into different aldehydes and other known carcinogens. And nicotine itself is just really bad for the adolescent brains because an adolescent's brain is under the process of development. A lot of the processes of the brain are significantly weaker in an adolescent than they are in an adult. And since nicotine impairs these already weakened brain functions, it really just harms their ability to remember things or do things that are really important. Nicotine specifically impairs cognition, reward processing, and the formation of memories. Thus, I'm finishing up my literature review, and I'm starting to look for gaps in the research for me to begin my original research on next year.
And now, to start the actual programming for tonight and wrap up our lovely show, I'd like to invite Derby Watson to come down. She's a sophomore scholar, and she will be praying for our seniors' presentations tonight.
Everybody, let's pray. Dear God, thank you for letting us all gather tonight to celebrate these seniors and all the hard work that they've put in over these past 4 years. We pray that you would be with them tonight as they present and guide their words. Please open our minds to understand what they have to say and our ears to hear. We pray that you would be with them as they leave HC and go out into college and beyond, and that you have great things in store for them. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
First up tonight is Emily Mallon, who has been one of my closest friends and a fantastic mentor. Over the past 3 years, she's helped make Friday night football games, and we're both there for band Bearable. She has taught me how to navigate high school, both literally and figuratively, and she has more or less filled the role of an older sister. I'm sure that I will miss her next year when she goes to Texas A&M to study English and psychology, and I'm sure her parents will miss her even more. Another topic Emily has taught me a lot about is stress, both how to manage it and what it looks like. You might even call her an expert in stress, and not just because she's been studying it for the past year. Tonight, you will hear about Emily's incredible work on how music exposure and practice can help moderate our stress, something that we've needed this past year.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that lovely introduction. And thank all of you for coming out today. This research is something that is the culmination of 4 years of study in DSP. And it's something that we've been specifically looking into for 2 years. So we really appreciate your support. This is something that's really important to us. And this night is really the culmination of everything we've learned throughout high school. So I cannot thank you enough from each and every one of us. That said, today I'm going to be discussing the impact of music on brain disorders and non-chronic stress. In the fall, I presented an outline of current research on the neuropsychology of music. Specifically, I explained that music impacts the brain in 2 fundamental ways. First of all, it boosts the production of certain neurotransmitters known as our happy chemicals. And these chemicals, which are specifically dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, play the role of making us feel good. They boost our mood and they decrease our stress. Another way that music impacts the brain is that it harnesses the brain's power of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the concept that our brains are ever evolving and ever changing to adapt to new stimuli and experiences and information in our environments as we encounter them. They do this through forming these things called neural connections. And these connections link old information to new information so that we're able to synthesize this new information into our schemas and understand what we are learning about. The way that music harnesses this power is that because music boosts the production of happy chemicals, music is naturally linked in our brains to positive mood. So therefore, no matter how upset we are, no matter how down we are, music most of the time can make us feel better because it is ingrained in our very neurochemistry that music is supposed to make us feel better. The impact of music on mood led me to look into the impact of music on people with abnormal mood conditions like brain disorders. And one of the disorders I looked into was Alzheimer's disease. This is the one that I found to be most significantly impacted by music, specifically music and its therapeutic application. I found that Alzheimer's disease, which most of you probably know is a degenerative brain disorder that gradually wears away cognitive processes, is able to be treated in marvelous ways by music. Because music exists in the part of the brain that is not damaged until the very end of Alzheimer's progression, this means that people suffering from the disease can recall memories or experiences they otherwise wouldn't have been able to remember when they associate them with music. In addition to helping improve memory in people with Alzheimer's disease, music also decreases general symptoms that many patients with Alzheimer's unfortunately suffer from, such as feelings of depression, isolation, and especially stress. The impact of music on stress in people with brain disorders, as I looked into a variety of them, made me realize that there was a gap in research about music's impact on us. I found that although there is plenty of information about music decreasing stress in people with brain disorders, there isn't much research about how music impacts those of us who don't have brain disorders but are still stressed. And this means that we're suffering from non-chronic stress, brought on by everyday life stressors and not brain disorders. Specifically, I decided that I wanted to look into the way music impacts a very common and relatively new stressor, COVID-19. Okay, so we're going to do a little interactive thing here, and I want you to raise your hand and keep it up if what I'm about to say applies. So how many of you have contracted COVID-19 or had a loved one contract COVID-19? Wow, okay, there's more than I thought. How many of you have had to do distance learning or distance teaching or distance working due to COVID-19? And then how many of you have a disease or a condition that makes you especially, keep them up please, that makes you especially vulnerable to COVID-19 or have a loved one with such a condition? And then finally, how many of you have gone into quarantine? Okay, so as we can see, it is most, if not all of us, are impacted by COVID. And this is because COVID is a significant stressor in our modern day lives. We not only have to worry about contracting the disease, although vaccinations do provide some hope for that in the recent future, we also have to worry about the fundamental ways in which it impacts and changes our lifestyle. Therefore, I wanted to see how music impacted this very common stressor. And I posed the question, does exposure to music reduce stress levels in teenagers who experience stress due to the COVID-19 pandemic? In order to examine this question, I had to create an original research methodology which helped me approach this query. First, I had to recruit participants for my study because I had to collect data based on real people, and I wanted to do a primary study where I generated my own data. So this is the actual form that I used to recruit my participants. As you can see, it is a Google form survey, and it was sent out to all Houston Christian High School students. I collected information about demographics such as race, sex, and age, and I also asked about experience with COVID-19, just like I just asked all of you. Furthermore, I asked about my patients if they had any mental disorders, or my participants, I'm sorry, if they had mental disorders. And I did this because I was seeking to examine solely non-chronic stress. So I didn't want to involve participants who had brain disorders that could make them experience chronic stress due to those disorders instead of just the non-chronic stress I wanted to analyze. So in the end, I had 84 people reply to my recruitment survey, which was a huge turnout. I'm very grateful for everyone who replied. Of these participants, 56 were expunged and did not go further in the process because they were either not interested in participating further in the study or because they had brain disorders that disqualified them from experiencing solely non-chronic stress. Of the remaining people, they were split into a control group and a variable group. The control group was composed of 18 people, and they were unable to attend music exposure sessions. The variable group was composed of 10 people who were able to attend music exposure sessions and who had experienced COVID-related stress in one of the forms I asked you all about earlier. The difference between the control and the variable group lies in the independent variable that my variable group was exposed to and my control group was not. And this variable is music exposure sessions. These sessions took place in January 2021 over the course of 3 weeks, and they occurred twice a week for a total of 5 sessions. They took place at Houston Christian Fine Arts block classes because this is the most controlled environment I could hope to attain for my study because it was a place where people's attention was entirely focused on music. These classes were 50 minutes long, and they took the form of choir, band, dance, or orchestra, as you can see in the pictures on the screen. And the people depicted in these pictures are past graduates of UC Christian that have attended fine arts class, and they're not participants in my study, but they are a depiction of what my participants would have been doing in these music exposure sessions. In order to analyze participant stress, I use what is called a mixed methods research design. And this basically means that I analyze both qualitative and quantitative data in order to gain the most holistic view of stress possible. The quantitative portion of my study consisted of something called the UC Berkeley stress test. This measure was designed by the University of California at Berkeley, and it synthesized two different very well-known psychological diagnostic tools. First of all, it took from the Beck Depression and Anxiety Inventory, which was developed by Dr. Beck, who is known as the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, so he is a big name in the psychological world. And it was developed in 1961. It was updated in 1996, and it is used as a diagnostic tool throughout America and the world today. The other half of UC Berkeley's survey was the Depression Anxiety Stress Scale. So this scale was developed by the University of New South Wales in 1996, and it is used as a diagnostic tool and was last updated in 2013. The reason that the University of California synthesizes two different measures is because they make up for one another's weaknesses. So, for example, the EDAI has sometimes been criticized for being too specific, so picking up on too few symptoms, whereas the DASS has been criticized for being too broad, so picking up on too many symptoms. Therefore, they sort of fill in the gaps that each other leave behind and provide me with the most holistic view of quantitative stress that I can provide. This quantitative portion of my survey was designed to help me refute my first null hypothesis, and a null is essentially a hypothesis I want to prove is not true in order for my estimate of my research to be correct. So this null stated subjects will report greater stress on the modified UC Berkeley stress test after prolonged exposure to music than they reported before exposure. The other portion of my study, because it is a mixed methods design, was qualitative, and this consisted of Dr. Gloria Wilcox's feeling wheel. This wheel, as you may have surmised, was created by a psychologist named Dr. Wilcox in 1982, and it is used largely for therapeutic purposes. As you can see, the wheel starts off in the center with very general emotions like mad or sad or joyful, and then as it branches out, the emotions get more specific. They don't get more severe or more chronic, but they do get more specific. And this is designed to help people identify what they're feeling so they can learn to cope with it. My participants were shown this wheel and asked to identify an emotion that currently described their emotional state. And these emotions either classified as negative, indicated by the top half of the wheel, or positive, indicated by the bottom half. This qualitative portion of my study was designed to help me refute my second null hypothesis, which states subjects will report more negatively connotated emotions on Dr. Gloria Wilcox's feeling wheel after music exposure than they reported before exposure. So all in all, the survey I sent out to my participants to gauge their stress consisted of two parts. First of all, there is the qualitative feeling wheel made by Dr. Gloria Wilcox, in which they were asked to identify an emotion, and I classified it as positive or negative. And then there is the quantitative UC Berkeley stress test. And again, this test consisted of two parts, and all the questions on this test were rated on a scale of 1 to 4. I did slightly modify the test to remove demographic questions that I already collected during my recruitment process, and I added a general 1 to 10 rating of stress so that I could gauge participants' overall self-evaluated stress. After I evaluated all of these numbers on the survey, I added them all up to result in this value I called my stress index score. And this was essentially a cumulative number that described their stress level. It could range from 16, indicating low stress, to 70, indicating high stress. Luckily, I didn't have anyone write down 70, but it didn't help with different close. And this is the actual survey that I used for my participants. As you can see, it has the general stress rating here on your right, and on the other side, it has the feeling of the participants for us to look at. My control participants filled this out once in the morning, once in the afternoon, every time a variable group music exposure session took place. And the variable group, since they were the ones attending music exposure, fills it out once before exposure to music and once after exposure. The rest of this survey consisted of statements from the UC Berkeley stress test, such as, I found myself getting upset rather easily, which are all symptoms of stress. And the participants were asked to rate their reactions to these on a scale of 1, meaning it didn't apply to them, to 4, meaning it applied to them most of the time. There were 20 questions total, and participants answered every question every time they filled out the survey. And at the end of all 5 of my music exposure sessions, and at the end of every participant filling out the survey, I had a lot of broad data process. So as you can imagine, I had 28 participants, and they each filled out the survey for 5 days, twice a day, and there were 20 questions on each survey, so that's a lot of numbers. And I had to come up with an efficient way to evaluate the significance of these numbers and to analyze what they mean. So I did this in the form of I'm about to show you using the example of VG1. So VG1 basically means this is a participant from the variable group, and I just assigned a random number for the sake of anonymity. So this variable group participant, as you can see, before music exposure, had a stress index score, which again is the sum of all their responses to the survey, of 23. And after music exposure, this score dropped to 17. So this is a change of -6 points on the stress index score rating. And I classified this -6 value as a change in stress index score. These changes could either be positive, indicating an increase in stress, negative, indicating a decrease in stress, or 0, which indicated no change in quantitative stress. The other qualitative value that I sought to analyze in participants' responses was the word they reported on the feeling wheel. As you can see, VG1 before music exposure was feeling tired, and afterward they were feeling content. So this I classified as a positive change because their emotion shifted from one on the negative side of the feeling wheel to on the positive. So a bad emotion to a good emotion. And this feeling wheel change could also be negative, indicating they shifted from a good emotion to a bad emotion, or no change, meaning their emotion remained consistent as to which half of the feeling wheel is located on. After I applied this method to all of my data, I had both qualitative and quantitative data to analyze, and I started with the quantitative. So I added up all of the responses from all of my participants throughout the 5 sessions, and I found that of my control group, 57% of participants reported a decrease in stress index score. This is a lot of a decrease in stress index score. My variable group, on the other hand, had nearly 80% of participants report a decrease in stress index score. This is a significant difference. You can see that more than 23% of more of my variable group than my control group experienced a decrease in stress. So again, this seems significant, but I had to actually test the validity of my results using a statistical test called a p-value test. And what a p-value is, essentially, is that it is a rating of the odds of randomly replicating a set of data. In order for your p-value to be able to refute a null, you want a value of less than 0.05, meaning the chances of randomly replicating your data would be less than 5 in 100. My p-value was actually less than 0.001. So that means the chances of randomly replicating my results are less than 1 in 1,000. This means that something I did and a variable I manipulated in the study, specifically music exposure, because that was my only independent variable, impacted my results. Therefore, I can refute my first null, and I can conclude that subjects reported less stress after exposure to music in the quantitative sense than they reported before exposure. Next, I analyzed my participants' quantitative change in stress, and I found that of my control group, 22.4% of respondents indicated a positive change in emotion. So again, this means that they shifted from feeling a bad emotion to a good emotion. Of my variable group, more than half of participants indicated a positive change in emotion. And this difference between groups is even more significant than it was in the quantitative sense. This is a difference of 29%. So almost 30% more of my variable group when compared to my control group experienced a positive change in emotion. And like I said before, this seems significant, but I had to statistically analyze it to confirm my results' validity. To do this, I used something called a chi-squared test for homogeneity. And this sounds complicated, but it is just a statistics test that generates a table of expected values when you plug in the values you're actually obtaining. Now, these expected values give you what you would expect your data to be if the two groups were homogeneous, meaning they had equal ratios of participants located in each of the different types of change. So that's positive, negative, and no change. As you can see here, my observed values were very different from my expected values, which indicates that something about what I did throughout the course of my research made my data not homogeneous and caused a difference between my two groups. So as you can see here, about 17 of my control group participants were expected via the chi-squared test for homogeneity to report a positive change in emotion. But in reality, only 11 of them did, so this is less than would have been expected statistically. On the other hand, 14 of the variable group participants were supposed, according to the chi-squared test, to report a positive change in emotion. But 20 of them did, so this is more than I expected, which indicates that something about my independent variable helped decrease their stress and helped them report a positive change in emotion. The chi-squared test also generated 2 numerical values that I could use to help refute my second man. First of all, there was the p-value, and in this case it was less than 0.02, which indicates the chances of randomly replicating my results are less than 2 in 100. and this is statistically significant. The other value that this table generated was called a chi-squared value. And this value is essentially the sum of all of the gaps between your observed and expected values. So it's the sum of all the differences. And if my data had been randomly generated and just statistically insignificant, this chi-squared value would have been about 5.99. However, in reality, this difference was greater. It was 8.34, which indicates that my data is statistically significant and just confirms the validity of my p-value. So this lets me refute my second null and come to the conclusion that participants not only reported less quantitative stress on the survey after DC exposure, they also reported less qualitative stress and had a positive change in emotion. After I was able to refute both of my null hypotheses, I was tasked with the responsibility of placing my data in the context of the broader neuropsychological community and of accounting for some potential alternative explanations for my data, meaning things outside the control of my research that could have contributed to my results. The first of these is called the cortisol awakening response. So I talked to you guys about cortisol in the fall. Cortisol is essentially your stress hormone, and it spikes whenever you get stressed out. So if a grizzly bear, I use this analogy in the fall, were to run through that door and turn at me, my cortisol levels would spike immediately high. And then if the bear just ran by me and out that door, my cortisol levels would slowly go back down and return to normal as my body approached homeostasis. But cortisol also plays another role in our bodies. It helps regulate our circadian rhythms. So cortisol is actually what wakes us up in the morning. When you wake, your cortisol spikes, which is what gets you out of bed. And then throughout the rest of the day, it gradually decreases again until you go back to sleep, when it starts rising again in preparation for waking up. So as you can see, because cortisol is associated with stress, and because cortisol levels naturally decrease throughout the day, it would have been natural for all of my participants to experience a decrease in stress from the first time they filled out the survey to the second time. However, what this phenomenon does not account for is the fact that my variable group had a greater frequency of decreasing stress than did my control group. They were both experiencing the same cortisol awakening response as far as any scientist knows. So therefore, this cannot account for the difference between them because they should have had the same decrease in stress. This was the only factor contributing to their decrease in stress. Another alternative explanation for my data that could have contributed to my findings is the fact that my variable group, while they were attending these exposure sessions, they were in social settings. So because they were at school attending fine arts classes, they were probably with their friends. And for most of us, being with our friends makes us feel less stressed. So this could have contributed to their decrease in stress. Furthermore, there are some biases that could have affected my data. So as most of you probably know, I went to school with about 450 people. And although I didn't tell my participants what my study was hoping to prove, I did tell a couple of my close friends, and word travels fast in this version. My participants could have figured it out and understood what I was trying to prove, and therefore altered their responses. However, this is pretty unlikely, especially if it's unlikely that the majority, or even more than half of my participants would have had this bias preference. So this isn't really significant, but it's worth mentioning. My data collection also has some limitations. First of all, my sample of participants was relatively homogeneous. They were all high school students between the ages of 14 and 18. They also all attended DSP Presentation. They were all private schools and might have had some similar experiences. They were also mostly white and mostly female. Another aspect of my study that could have limited the validity of my results is the fact that the measures I used, specifically Dr. Gloria Wilcox's feeling wheel and the EDAI, for the Vector Depression and Anxiety Inventory, face some criticisms from neuroscientists and psychologists. However, these criticisms, which accuse these tests of being outdated, are few and far between. It's just the occasional psychologist who will crop up and say, this test needs to be modernized. But for the most part, they're shut down pretty quickly because most of the neuropsychological world believes these tests are already modern and are already relevant to the world we now live in. Another limitation of my data is the fact that I collected data over a shorter time frame than I initially planned on collecting. I initially wanted to have 8 sessions of music exposure, but as I mentioned earlier, I only had 5, and this is because, unfortunately, Choir had to cancel 3 of their practices, so I had to cancel my music exposure sessions because I couldn't get kids to just go to the choir classroom and sit there in class. And yeah, so this did limit the time frame of my data, but it didn't limit the validity of my data because my results are still statistically significant and they do provide an insight into the nature of music's impact on stress. The final limitation, and perhaps the most significant of my data, is the fact that, as you'll remember, I was seeking to analyze COVID-19 related stress. But the difficulty in this is that even though all of my participants reported that they had experienced COVID-related stress on their recruitment survey, it's very difficult to isolate the stressor. Meaning my participants could have been experiencing stress due to COVID, or it could have been due to the fact that they had a test that day, or they were fighting with their friends, but they stayed up late cramming to finish a paper that was due the next day. There was no way of knowing exactly what was stressing my participants out, even though I know COVID did play a role in their stress. So therefore, I can't definitively state that music exposure specifically decreases COVID-related stress, but I can say that it decreases general non-chronic stress, which is perhaps an even more broadly applicable statement that could be more useful to the world of music neuropsychology. In the end, despite some of the alternative explanations and limitations of my study, my results are still significant. I was able to reject both of my nulls, which lends validity to my data. Furthermore, there was a great difference between my control and variable groups. Specifically, my variable group reported a greater decrease in both quantitative and qualitative stress. And this indicates that none of the limitations or alternative explanations I previously discussed could have contributed solely to my data because of this difference between groups. Therefore, the only thing that you can attribute this difference to is the independent variable, which was the only difference between the procedure that the control and variable groups underwent, and this is music exposure. So therefore, I am able to conclude that music can decrease stress levels and can make us feel better. In the context of the world of neuropsychology, my findings present some new information about the way music impacts our brains. First of all, I found that even though research about preventative music exposure for decreasing stress had been done, there wasn't much about reactionary exposure. So preventative music exposure to decrease stress is essentially the idea that if you listen to music before you experience a stressor, that stress response will be less severe. You won't get as stressed out once you experience it. However, I examine music as a reactionary treatment. And this is the idea that I can already be stressed out and then listen to music and feel better anyway, even though I didn't do it before I became stressed. This has not been examined in depth in the world of music neuropsychology. So my findings about how music can be used as a reactionary treatment for stress are very important to this community. Furthermore, my findings solve the question that I initially wanted to examine. And that is that music can decrease non-chronic stress. It's not just applicable to people with brain disorders. It can help everyday people experiencing everyday stressors just like you and I. In the future, my findings could be explored in a lot more depth. You could use a larger sample size or even a smaller one if you wanted a specific information about a certain group. You could increase the diversity of my sample because, as I mentioned, it was relatively homogeneous. And you could also conduct my study over a longer time frame in order to examine the long-term impact of music on stress. But overall, my results indicate that music makes us feel better. I think this is something most of us intuitively know. In fact, I think it's something that mankind has known for centuries. I mean, you can read documents like the Bible that are centuries old and find accounts of characters like David and Miriam using music to decrease their stress and boost their mood. When David was on the run in the wilderness from King Saul, who was trying to kill him, he wrote psalms, which were essentially songs. So David, as you can see, was using music even back then as a tool to decrease his stress. And this is something that many of us still do today. I mean, how many of you are excited to get out of work or school so you can turn on the radio in your car and just relax and go back home? So music makes us feel good. And I think this is something, as I said, we all intuitively know, but my findings confirm this feeling and provide evidence to back up this idea that music decreases our stress. So I hope that what you take away from this is that sometimes if you're stressed out, whether it's due to work or school or personal life or even to COVID-19, feeling less stressed really can be as simple as picking up a guitar or turning on the radio or putting in your Netflix. Thank you so much, and are there any questions?
First of all, you did incredible. That was really good. My question is, do you think that the participants self-evaluating their own stress affect your results?
Yes, okay. That's actually something I wanted to talk about, but didn't have enough time. So the fact that all of my data was self-evaluated does pose somewhat of a limitation on my study, because my participants were all reporting their own stress. I wasn't analyzing it like using, I know a lot of psychologists use like sweat monitors to determine how stressed people are, because that's something perspective to record those things. But my data was self-evaluated, as Jackie mentioned. But I think that the limitations of self-evaluated data include, first of all, the fact that people are afraid to be judged. So if someone was sitting there and their friend was next to them, filling it out, like watching them float out over their shoulder, then they could have altered their responses and they wouldn't be judged. And they also could have feared I was going to judge them and change their responses. And I think another thing is that I was working with high schoolers, right? And so some of them might have had limited introspective abilities and not completely knowing what they were feeling. Because teenager's already a rocky time. And it's sometimes hard to identify what exactly you're feeling in life. So that could have posed a limitation because they could have been like, I don't know, really frequent questions. But I think the fact that my data was so consistent throughout my different groups indicates that despite these limitations of self-evaluating data, there was something that all of these people had in common, whether that was that they were limited introspectively or not. And I believe that was exposure because of the difference. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes.
Excellent job, Emily. As you looked at your questionnaire, did you evenly weigh all the responses, or was there any type of different way on the questions? When you have a quantitative and qualitative side, did you evenly weigh those when you looked at your statistical?
So that's a good question, and that is why I evaluated my qualitative and quantitative separately, because I had two different nulls. So I used my qualitative data for my second null, my quantitative for my first. That way I didn't have to compare them to each other because they're so different. But I could sort of make separate statements about how music impacts quantitative and qualitative stress, because those are, when you're numbering your stress versus when you're describing your stress, they're sort of different measures and they provide different information. So I did look at them separately so that they wouldn't one more important.
Yeah, really nice presentation and timely topic and nice bit of analysis. I noticed that your participants were mostly active participants in music events. A lot of folks also spend a lot of time with earbuds in their ears listening to music. So I was wondering, in your literature review or your study, if you came across anything that might indicate a difference in the impact on stress relief with either active or passive participation.
Okay, that's actually something that I included in my section about future exploration, because a lot of the research on music therapy indicates that, again, I didn't perform music therapy as a non-licensed therapist, all I did was expose people, but a lot of the research on music therapy does indicate that there is a difference between the way our brains react when we're composing music or like playing music versus when we're sitting and being exposed to the taking event. And this is definitely something that could be evaluated more depth in my study, but there was already a lot of data that exists about this, because this is something that people are very interested in. It's a lot of neuroscience, it's a lot of the way your brain reacts to things. So, for example, when you're playing music or composing, both sides of your brain fire, which is something I actually discussed in the law. But when you're listening, it's only one side of your brain is firing, and that's short. So that's an interesting aspect of it that, yeah, definitely could be evaluated, but I didn't go that in depth to do the analysis of those.
Did you factor in at all the type of music that the individuals were listening to or participating in, key, tempo?
That's sort of similar to this question, and that is something I would have loved to look into. Before I started this research, my uncle actually works in the field of music, and he mentioned to me about what I was talking about in my paper, and he's talking to me about how different keys are associated with different emotions and everything, which as a musician I find really interesting, and I would love to look into it. But because my music exposure sessions took place in 4 different areas, 5 different times, there would have been 20 different varieties of music to look into. And I had a lot on my plate reviewing both of my goals, because methods research design is pretty involved, because I had to use the same process twice, basically, and do double work. But if I had more time, that is definitely something I would love to look into. It's fascinating.
Did your control group know that the ones that receiving the independent variable were receiving music?
I did not tell them. They might have heard from someone. I mean, I told my DSP class and I told a couple of my friends. They might have heard, but I didn't tell them directly because I didn't want to cause any bias. That's sort of something I touched on in my limitation section, because there could have been biases, but I didn't directly inform them because I wanted them to be as honest as possible with their responses.
All right, so that is all the time that we're going to have for questions for Emily. Can we get a hand for her? All right, so next up we have Matthew Lollinger. So Matthew is going to be attending St. John's College, and he's going to be double majoring in philosophy and history of mathematics and science. He chose this college because they make a point in their curriculum to read a bunch of great works of Western literature and analyze them. So here at HC, he has been on the robotics team all 4 years. In his spare time, he enjoys paragliding and building things. He's built a few things. He's built a Tesla coil. He's built a nuclear fusion reactor, and currently he's working on an actual clock mechanism. But even his vast knowledge of engineering is greatly dwarfed by his knowledge of religion and philosophy. I mean, have a conversation with him about religion or philosophy, and he'll answer all 100 of your questions and leave you with 500 more questions you need answered. So without any further ado, here is Matthew Lollinger.
Thank you, Robert. Good evening. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for coming out to our presentations. At the beginning of the year, I gave an introduction to some of the relevant topics in moral philosophy to evaluate whether or not a type of moral action called supererogatory actions can actually be performed by someone. In order to more effectively explain why I have now concluded that supererogatory actions do not exist, I will first give a brief introduction to some of the relevant background information from my previous introduction presentation. The central concept under scrutiny is supererogation. Put simply, supererogation is going beyond the call of duty. We tend to think of humans as having a certain set of actions which impose our individual obligations. Actions such as telling the truth and treating other people fairly seem to be part of this universal set of human moral obligations. Similar to these obligatory actions, supererogatory actions are morally valuable and positive. The difference is that supererogatory actions transcend this limited set of moral obligations. When a war hero jumps onto a grenade to save his fellow comrades, or a missionary at the expense of his own needs helps poor and starving people in some difficult part of the world, they perform morally valuable actions, but their actions do not seem to be part of their moral duties. Thus, we have come to think of supererogation as an action that someone could perform as a result of our intuitions about what is morally valuable and what is morally required. Even though it is truly a good and heroic thing when the war hero saves his friends, no one in their right mind would think that he was merely doing his duty, and anyone else in that position would have had the same obligation. All of this seems to lead to the relevant and important question each one of us has to answer about how we conduct ourselves in our daily lives. Must we live like a saint or hero, always doing extravagantly good things because it's our obligation? Put it another way, must we be moral maximizers? Must every action we perform be maximized to the greatest possible moral value? An answer to this very practical question ultimately relies on an understanding of supererogation and if they really exist. That is why it's important to think very analytically and philosophically about this question. Indeed, much work has been done by philosophers in an attempt to understand these actions. By analyzing some of our basic intuitions about what supererogatory acts are, philosophers have argued for three conditions that, if they are simultaneously true for some action, then that action would be supererogatory. Calvin University philosopher Gregory Lima identifies these three necessary conditions Second, it is an act whose performance is morally praiseworthy or meritorious. Third, it is an act whose omission is not morally blameworthy. The first condition certainly seems obvious. Supererogatory acts go beyond duties so they can't fulfill an obligation. The second and third conditions, which rely on the ideas of blameworthiness and praiseworthiness, also seem intuitively obvious. A person being either blameworthy or praiseworthy for performing some action simply entails two ideas: that the person is actually responsible for the action, and whether or not the action is morally good or morally bad. When someone is responsible for performing an action that is morally good, they are praiseworthy. And when someone is responsible for performing an action that is morally bad, they are blameworthy. My argument will hinge more on the good versus evil aspect of praise and blame, rather than the responsibility aspect. To show why it is the case that supererogatory actions do not exist, I have created a simple logical syllogism, where if the two premises are true, the conclusion will follow logically and necessarily. The argument is as follows. 1. If the three conditions for supererogation cannot be fulfilled for an action simultaneously, then supererogation does not exist. 2. The three conditions cannot be fulfilled for an action simultaneously. Therefore, supererogation does not exist. The first premise should be fairly obvious. Each condition is necessary for supererogation to exist, and only when all three conditions are met by the same action is it the case that supererogation exists. This means that when one condition is not met, that action cannot be supererogatory. Thus, if I show that any two of the three conditions cannot possibly be true for some action simultaneously, then I will succeed in showing that supererogation does not exist. The success of my argument then depends on the truth of premise 2. I must show that at least two of the three conditions cannot be true for some action simultaneously. I will argue that at least the first two conditions cannot be true for the same action. That is, the action cannot fulfill an obligation and be morally praiseworthy. To show why this is the case, I must argue for the ethical framework that makes it the case. Condition 1 demands an understanding of moral obligations, and condition 2 demands an understanding of moral praiseworthiness. My argument for the truth of premise 2 will rely on a natural law conception of moral obligations, and I will explain moral praiseworthiness in terms of a privation theory of goodness and badness. These two ideas have a long history and are very large in their scope. Each one of them really requires their own presentation, but hopefully my brief explanation will at least show why condition 1 and condition 2 are incompatible, even if I can't be as thorough in explaining the two ideas as I might need to be. The account of moral goodness, which my argument employs, and which I will defend, is the classical Christian account called the privation theory of evil. One of the earliest defenders of this theory was the 4th century theologian Augustine of Hippo. He stated, evil is a privation or corruption that exists in something that was originally good and perfect. For Augustine, goodness is simply what really exists, and evil is like a disease which subtracts from and distorts ultimate reality. Just like a shadow does not exist in any way independent from light, evil doesn't exist in any way independent from goodness. This idea has been adopted by theologians from across history and is the predominant view in Christian theological literature. The reason for its predominance is that it adequately addresses the problem that if God is the creator of everything that exists, and evil exists, then God would then be the creator of evil. Because Christians don't accept that God created evil, the privation theory of evil allows for Christians to deny that evil really exists, thus preserving God's goodness in creation. Thus, for Christians, this account of moral goodness and badness should be an attractive option. However, even for a non-Christian views established, I can now explain how they lead to the truth of premise 2 and how they then show that supererogatory acts do not exist. First, however, I want to re-emphasize the structure of my argument. There are 3 conditions for supererogatory acts. 1, the action fulfills no duty or obligation. 2, the performance of the action is morally praiseworthy. And 3, the omission of the action is not morally blameworthy. When all these conditions are true for the same action, then that action is supererogatory. However, if I can show that it is impossible for at least 2 of these conditions to be true for some action at the same time, I will show that supererogatory actions cannot exist. I've chosen to show why condition 1, the action is not fulfilling duty, and condition 2, the performance of the action is morally praiseworthy, are mutually incompatible. I would argue that other combinations of the conditions are incompatible, but I only need to show why at least one of these combinations is incompatible in order for my argument to be successful. To make my argument successful, I need to make 2 observations about what I've said so far. The first observation is about condition 1 and the nature of moral obligations I just argued for. A natural law theory of obligations entails a strict parity in every action someone could perform. Actions are either rational or they are not rational. There is no third option. This means actions either successfully actualize some unactualized potential or they do not. Natural law theory entails that anything involving human obligations is either obligatory or forbidden. There are no merely morally neutral actions. The second observation I want to make is about condition 2, that the performance of the action is morally praiseworthy. I stated earlier that for the performance of an action to be praiseworthy, the action itself must be morally good. Thus, the concept of praiseworthiness is connected to the concept of moral goodness. But I just argued for a view of moral goodness which identifies good with Aristotle's form of cause. Something is good insofar as it is fully actualized. Thus, for someone to be morally praiseworthy, they must have performed an action which actualizes some unactualized potential. These 2 observations on the nature of obligation and praiseworthiness ultimately prove their simultaneous incompatibility. If humans have an obligation to use their rationality to actualize their potential, and any other actions are forbidden because neutral actions exist, how can someone perform an action which transcends duty in a positive way? The only actions which are not beautiful are forbidden. If supererogatory actions exist, then they would be by definition a non-dutiful action. But surely supererogatory acts are not forbidden, as the parody would imply. In fact, the performance of an act of a supererogatory act is morally good and thus can make someone morally praiseworthy. Forbidden actions are forbidden because they are morally bad and make an agent morally blameworthy. Thus, there are no non-dutiful actions someone could perform which also make one morally praiseworthy. Natural law theory entails that insofar as practical rationality enables us, we must be moral maximizers. One cannot over-actualize themselves and thus warrant praise for a non-dutiful action. Because these 2 conditions for supererogatory acts cannot be true for some actions simultaneously, supererogation does not exist. Now, let's return to the 2 examples I gave at the start of this presentation. Humans came up with the category of supererogatory action in order to explain heroic actions like a war hero jumping on a grenade, or a missionary going above and beyond helping less fortunate people. Why do these actions still seem to be the type of action which goes above and beyond our call of duty? Why do they still seem to be supererogatory? I think this can best be explained by employing the Reformation doctrine of vocation. The doctrine of vocation, broadly speaking, is the idea that different people have different obligations in addition to their universal human obligations. Yes, all humans have an obligation to be kind and honest, but in addition to that, each human has unique moral obligations. For some, it may be to be a doctor or teacher. For others, it may be to be a missionary or a war hero. As I discussed earlier, I think obligations are best understood as the essence of a person. Thus, if people have different individual essences, in addition to the similar aspect of their essence, then they will have different moral obligations And I can take any questions. Yes.
Thanks, John. So just a quick thought. So suppose I wanted to show you you're wrong. And so next week I set myself the task of going to the soup kitchen 5 days a week, every day, to volunteer. And it's not a morally neutral action because there are moral reasons to do it. But I'm not doing it because I feel any sense of duty. I know I'm pretty wrong. And I'm going to help some people in the process. So I go to the soup kitchen each day, every day, all week. So I don't feel like I was obligated. I wouldn't be blameworthy if I didn't do it. And doing it is pretty because I'm doing something more like that. It seems to satisfy the pretty conditions.
It does seem to satisfy those conditions, but I would argue that it was obligatory if that was your particular vocation.
But I stipulated that I didn't really feel like it was. Mainly I just want to prove you wrong.
Okay, so if that does actualize some actualized potential, if it is a morally good action, then I would say, and that was your calling to do that, to try and prove my view wrong, then in that case,
It wasn't my calling. I'm just being obstinate. See, God didn't tell me to do it. I'm just telling myself because I'm that determined to show you that you're wrong.
So motive. Yeah, so does the motive of each individual action play into the realization, I think is probably.
yeah, I think it would. I think there is something about intent which would make our actions, it would actualize the potential that we have in ourselves if we have a good intent.
So using his example, the motive of him wanting to prove you wrong decreases the actualization of the good that you're doing.
Well, I don't necessarily want to say whether or not doing that would be a morally good or bad thing, but if it is a morally good thing, then I think that him having that particular feeling at that moment to do that thing would then be an obligation. If it is a morally good thing.
Yeah, it strikes me as trying to fix your flaws, right? Because the idea is, whatever my motive this week is, the idea was I'm not doing it because I said God's called to do it. I'm going next week though because I want to help people and so forth. Not because God, I feel like God has given that to me as a vocation. But maybe I've been lazy and I haven't helped people as much as I, really could. And I thought, what the heck? I've got extra time and energy. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna volunteer, not because I feel like a sense of duty, but it's just that would be a cool thing to do and help people. So I'm doing it voluntarily, out of a sense of traditional vocation. So it doesn't seem like an obligation. It seems like it's praiseworthy. And it seems like I wouldn't be blameworthy if I didn't do it. So again, there's a very strong appearance of superiority.
Yeah, there is that appearance, but ontologically, I think, there's an epistemological question about whether or not that something is genuinely fulfilling
Rochester University, and also Matthew's mentors helped us tremendously. So this is what they do. But I believe it's time to move on.
We can round of applause for Matthew for that conversation. So, last but most certainly not least, we have Christian Gawley. All right. So we have Christian Gawley. Here at HC, he's a Camp West End counselor. He is a student ambassador, a member of NHS, Model UN, and the football team, and he is the soccer team captain. So he is still waiting on financial aid packages to decide which college he's going to between Princeton, UT Austin, and University of Pennsylvania. So normally when a student has that impressive of a lineup of schools, we'd be congratulating him on making it in. But in this scenario, I think that we should be congratulating whichever one of the three he decides to attend. So his favorite DSP memory was they were on the London trip, and he got stuck in the tube, which is what they call the subway over there. And he got stuck in it.
Not my fault.
So Christian's research regarding space covers everything from the science behind making a rocket to his recent discovery of alien life. Okay, maybe not that last part, but while I think we can all agree that aliens would make almost anything cooler, I feel like you'll still have a hard time spacing out during his presentation on aerospace.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about innovation, design, and economics in the U.S. aerospace and aviation industries, specifically an assessment on the fiscal and developmental impact of global crisis. And yes, this time I have a mic, so that's just a little bit nicer. So globally, the aerospace and aviation industries account for a $1.61 trillion GDP. And whether you have watched the Space Shuttle or Falcon X launch on television, flown on an airplane, or even used your phone's cellular device capabilities, you've somehow been impacted by the innovation in the aerospace and aviation industries. And so this massive role, often behind the scenes, that the aviation and aerospace industries play led me to ask in the fall, how have technological advancements over the last 60 years influenced aerospace design, and what economic impact do these advancements possess over the American private and government sectors, specifically as evidenced in the space industry? And so if I could sum up everything that I talked about in the fall, it would be that these two industries fall into a cycle of innovation, where high preliminary investment costs are offset by cost savings associated with implementation. For example, the development of the computing chip in the 1940s and 1950s has ultimately led through innovation and evolution of technology to the creation of modern avionics computers. So when you're on an airplane, you don't crash, most of the time. And Ms. PMAC ought to know a lot about this, but there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape that exists in American industries. And what this cycle of innovation allowed the aerospace and aviation industry to do was cultivate a cycle and culture of deregulation, where the government is not as involved in the developmental process. However, and this trend is not just shown in the aerospace industry, but if you work in the financial sector, this is also apparent there. What deregulation ultimately causes is it leaves the industry vulnerable to spontaneous events. And so while I was conducting my research in the fall, I found that these came in the form of global crises, such as the 9/11 attack, the 2003 SARS outbreak, as well as the 2008 financial recession. And so while these events were particularly impactful on our own personal lives, on an industry-wide perspective, they were crippling because they lowered demand and subsequently lowered revenue and investment. And so, since we're now in the time of COVID, which is arguably the worst event in aviation and aerospace history, there's been a gap in the research as to the association between the presence of these global crises and the performance of the industry. And therefore, using this gap in the research, I was able to ask a new research question, which I've analyzed in the past few months. And this reads, how have deadly global events such as the novel coronavirus outbreak influenced the economic structure and developmental progress of the aerospace and aviation industries? So now I'm going to talk about the general method that I used to analyze or answer the research question. My general method was centered around what's known as a time series analysis. So I had the events that I previously mentioned. So 9/11, SARS, the recession, COVID-19, and then I also included a baseline. And so what a time series analysis allowed me to do was use past and present trends and compare them to each other and sort of weigh their differences. I was also able to analyze variable recovery within a 95% confidence interval, meaning that within the next 5 years, hopefully the confidence intervals I've accumulated should show a range of how the variable will recover. Lastly, I chose the overarching metrics of demand, revenue, and investment because without these three things, the industry simply couldn't function. And this allowed me to analyze three null hypotheses. And so what this is, or null hypothesis is essentially a statement that I'm seeking to disprove through some form of statistical analysis. And so my personal reads, the majority of aerospace and aviation-related companies have not seen a significant decrease in demand as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. My second reads, the majority of aerospace and aviation-related companies have not seen a significant decrease in cash flow and revenue streams as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And my third reads, the majority of aerospace and aviation-related companies have not seen a significant decrease in investment as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. With regards to how I went about collecting my data, so within these three umbrella metrics, I discovered 23 independent variables that I could use to test my nulls. I conducted either a quarterly or annual analysis of these data within the past 20 years, and I gathered over 1,700 data points to ultimately refute my nulls. I looked at the companies of Delta, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin, as I mentioned in the fall, because they have a majority share of whatever market they're in. And this outlines my general process. So I consulted data sources, which included the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, the Department of Commerce, Y charts, as well as Yahoo Finance, and then I imported that data into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And then I subsequently used Microsoft Statistical Analysis software to create a graph that shows how the variable has responded within the past 20 years. And while I don't expect you to read that graph because you could, it's pretty impressive, this is just outlining my general process that I went through. Ultimately, what I discovered is that there is a lack of a baseline equation. So essentially, this represents how the industry would respond if there were not, if the presence of global crises was nullified. And yes, this is a complex equation. There's a hand, there's more specifics on the hand. You don't need it. Essentially, the natural log of whatever variable I'm studying is equal to a variety of weighted variables. And these include supply and demand shifters, as well as, novel things such as, if a Thanksgiving break goes long, or if there's a 29th day in February because of a leap year. Because while these events may seem insignificant, they actually factor into how the industry is performing at the time. After doing all this, I figured I needed to have a way to actually disprove my nulls, and so I took a three-pronged approach. My first involved using what's known as an ANOVA test. And so, as I mentioned, I had data sets for 5 different categories. And so what an ANOVA test allowed me to do was take the averages of all of these categories and compare them and contrast them to each other to determine whether there's any statistically significant differences in the means. Ultimately, I get a p-value, so like in Emily's presentation, I get a p-value, and if it's less than 0.05, then I can determine that there's statistical significance. However, what this p-value represents is it's known as an omnibus test statistic. So what that means is that while I can tell you there's statistical significance, I can't tell you where it essentially comes from. And so to solve this, I use what's known as a post hoc t-test. And so once I had established statistical significance, I could use this test to analyze the independent means of each group. For example, I could use, I could compare 9/11 to COVID, SARS to COVID, the recession to COVID, and then all of these data to a baseline. and ultimately I could test statistical significance on a more specific scale. After doing all this, I needed a way to test my broad null that I had previously presented. And so I did this through what's called Fisher's method test. So I'd done about 23 independent ANOVA tests, but I needed a way, like I said, to combine their independent p-values. And so using a chi-square distribution, I was able to combine the values of these null hypotheses to refute my nulls. So what did I find? From the demand side of things, this graph shows airline revenue passenger miles in the last 20 years. So what a revenue passenger mile is it's essentially 1 mile per paying passenger. So if I took a 150-mile flight to New Orleans, I would rack up 150 revenue passenger miles. During 9/11, the industry exhibited an almost 15 billion revenue passenger mile loss, and this trend was also mirrored during the financial recession. However, as seen by this massive dip on the right side. Yeah, the right side. The industry showed an almost 500% decrease in revenue passenger miles as a result of COVID, and this equates to almost 80 billion revenue passenger miles. However, while the passenger side of the aviation industry was suffering, the cargo side was staying alive. So during COVID-19, unlike the passenger side of the aviation industry, the cargo industry exhibited an uptick in demand during the pandemic. And of course, I'm going to go into why I think this is the case later. From the raw side, from analyzing the raw side of the data, this graph, it has a lot of information, only focusing on the left two sides, because the right two I'm going to focus when I'm actually repeating my null. But out of all 5 variables I analyzed for demand, only total U.S. aircraft orders proved not statistically significant. Therefore, despite this outlier, I was able to say, and I was able to reject my null hypothesis on demand and state that COVID-19 has in fact had a significant and negative impact on demand. From the revenue side of things, this graph shows U.S. airline net income. So this is essentially how much money is the industry making per quarter. As you can see, it's pretty consistent, with notable exceptions in 2005 and 2006, which I will also discuss. But during the time of COVID-19, the airline industry exhibited an almost $20 billion quarterly loss in net income, which is definitely a lot of money. I analyzed 8 different variables for revenue, with all of them proving statistically significant. Therefore, I was also able to reject my null hypothesis on revenue. And I could state that COVID-19 also had a significant and negative impact on aerospace and aviation revenue. Lastly, regarding investment, this graph shows Boeing's return on invested capital in the past 20 years. So what this is say I put in $1, I invested $1 into something. If it's positive, that means I made money. So if I put in $1, my return on invested capital is 2%. I made 2 cents on that dollar. It's been pretty consistently positive over the past 20 years. However, during COVID, Boeing exhibited its first negative return on invested capital in 2 decades. With regards to my variables, I analyzed 9 of them, with Boeing's investing capital, investing cash flow, and Lockheed Martin's investing cash flow proving not statistically significant. However, despite these 2 outliers, I was also able to reject my null hypothesis on investment and state that COVID-19 also has had a significant and negative impact on aviation and aerospace investment. So now I'm going to go into why I think this is the case. And so earlier in the presentation, I had mentioned how the industry falls into the cycle of innovation. But while I was evaluating my findings, I realized that there's another cycle into how the industry actually performs, and that is based on metrics of demand, revenue, and investment. Specifically, that if one rises, the other 2 subsequently rise, and one falls, the other 2. Decreases in demand, which have been evidenced by the pandemic, have shown that there's decreased opportunities for revenue. Therefore, one can logically assume that there's less revenue. And then, if there's less revenue, companies have less free money to spend on investments, and therefore their investing amount also decreases. As I talked about earlier, while the majority of the industry was suffering, the cargo industry showed an uptick in demand. And so I can usually attribute this to the prevalence of Amazon. So during the pandemic, I know the majority of us have forgone in-person shopping due to mask mandates or in-person limitations, and gone to services such as Amazon to get products shipped to our homes. And so what this trend has seen is that the cargo industry its demand has been artificially inflated by the presence of the pandemic, and this trend is set to continue for the next 5 years. However, on a more broad spectrum, what this graph shows is what's called the consumer price index. And so what this graph shows is how willing are you or I to spend our free capital? In my case, it's none, but of course it's going to vary for all of y'all. But during 9/11 and the recession, consumer price index decreased significantly. And so as I've proven that COVID-19 has actually been more impactful than these two events, one can only imagine how drastic the decrease in consumer price index might be. And so what this means is that because consumers are less willing to spend whatever money they might have, demand is subsequently going to go down with that revenue and investment. Also, I talked about the notable exceptions in airline net income over the past 20 years, with them being in 2005 and 2006. Also, I talked about the significant decrease in net income during COVID. So I can attribute this to the aerospace and aviation industry's reliance on the surrounding macroeconomic environment. Specifically, I looked at how fuel costs might factor into this, and how fuel costs also dictate how the industry performs. And so how many of you drive? I'm guessing it's the majority of y'all. And during COVID, we were all enjoying when gas prices were less than $2, right? Because it means we got to save a little bit of extra cash. And so the aerospace industry also loved decreased gas prices, decreased fuel prices, because fuel expenditures account for more than 20% of the industry's losses. And so decreases in gas prices have also seen that the industry hasn't responded as significantly to COVID-19 as one might expect. Also, the passing of the stimulus bill, known as the CARES Act under the Trump administration, also gave companies the ability to not exhibit as many losses during the pandemic, because they were able to raise up to $25 billion in capital to either avoid bankruptcy or pay off their workers, so not many of them got laid off. Ultimately, the implications of these findings. So the air transport industry, this industry accounts for over $3 trillion in associated economic benefits. So when you factor in all of the things that aerospace and aviation affects, it's more than $3 trillion in worth. During the pandemic, this has decreased by 33%. And so what this shows is that the aerospace and aviation industry's reliance on the macroeconomic environment, as well as the presence of these global crises, is going to significantly affect not only the global economy, but also the workforce. The aviation and aerospace industries employ over 65 million people worldwide. And during COVID-19, we've seen tens of thousands of workers laid off as a result of the pandemic. And so we can see that the presence of these global crises has both an impact on the individual as well as the overarching environment. Also, the presence of the pandemic and global crisis in general has been a catalyst for innovation. Companies are losing revenue and they're hemorrhaging money daily as a result of the ongoing presence of coronavirus. And this has caused companies such as Boeing and Airbus to lower their production forecast by up to 50% in the next decade. And so this decrease in demand is causing companies to find new ways to cut costs and also new ways to increase demand. And also, on a smaller point of view, it's causing what's known as industry concentration. And so the presence of the pandemic has caused a lot of small and medium-sized companies to actually step out of the industry because of bankruptcy. And this has caused companies such as SpaceX and Lockheed Martin to kind of establish, it's not a monopoly per se, but it's nearing that. From a more social point of view, the effect of COVID-19 on the aerospace and aviation industries is bad for the consumer. So you or I, during COVID-19, I can remember when prices for flights were like $30. It was, it's pretty cheap to travel. But unfortunately, as the industry starts to recover from this pandemic, ticket prices are going to go up, meaning we might not be able to travel so much, but it's whatever. Also, the industry exhibits what's known as inter-industry linkages, meaning that it has a lot of effects, and the performance of the industry has a lot of rippling effects on other industries in the United States. And so one thing I can attribute this to is what's known as the airport and manufacturing industry. So because there's decrease in demand, there subsequently has to be decrease in supply, or else the market is going to get all out of whack. And so the manufacturing, aerospace, airport industries are also suffering. Also, federal agencies such as NASA, they're integral in aerospace and aviation innovation. But because of the stimulus bill, there's been increased downward budgetary pressure on the industry and on the agencies specifically to cut costs and find ways that they can decrease expenditures. And so this is going to result in some developmental stagnation. It's not included on this, but also another point I wanted to highlight was that the passing of the CARES Act and the subsequent reliance of the industry on the stimulus it's provided is most likely going to cause what's called a zombie economy. So what this means is that when industries are too reliant on stimulus as a method of garnering revenue, then it's going to logically precede a market crash. So, in 5, 10 years, and yes, this is pretty dreary, but in 5, 10 years, if the airline industry ultimately does collapse and its associated infrastructure does collapse, we'll know that Christian Wally, 2021, did mention this during his presentation. And as all good research has some form of limitation, one thing that I found was that I was only able to analyze public sector companies because they publish regular and reliable economic reports. So companies such as SpaceX, they might publish a report every 2 or 3 years, whereas Boeing and Lockheed Martin have to present an economic report every quarter for their shareholders. And so more research could be done into how the private sector responded, and maybe if there's any differences. Also, while my research is only establishing a relationship between the presence of global crises and the effect of the industry performance, what more research needs to be done on how the industry could attempt to mitigate these impacts through either policy initiatives or financial restructuring methods. So, while we can intuitively infer that COVID-19, of course, had a negative impact on the industry, my research sought to prove that COVID-19, in fact, did have the worst effect on how the industry was performing in the past 20 years. And what this allows researchers to do is maybe they can utilize my research to show how the impact of these global crises impacts performance and how they can take steps to mitigate these in the future. As I mentioned, 20 out of my 23 variables actually showed negative quarter-on-quarter or year-on-year performance issues as a result of the pandemic. And this allowed me to disprove all 3 of my null hypotheses, showing that my research was in fact significant. Unfortunately for the industry, it's not set to recover for a timetable anything worth between 1 and 3 years, meaning that if the pandemic does subside, and hopefully it will with mask mandates and vaccination efforts increasing, that the industry is still going to feel the long-term effects of the pandemic. So thank you for your time, and for the last time, if you have any questions.
There seemed like a ton of variables you can analyze within the aerospace demand, revenue, and investment. So why did you specifically choose the 23 variables on Canva?
So to be honest, it was kind of because they were the easiest to find. Of course, I have limited resources as a high school student researching this topic, but yeah, they were generally the easiest to find because they were publishing these economic reports. And while this could be a potential limitation, because again, there's so many variables that you can test within the industry, the variables that I selected account for a pretty comprehensive overview of demand, revenue, and investment. For example, I analyzed net income, which accounts for things such as, spontaneous losses, taxes, depreciation, interest, and it accounts for a variety of different variables, and that's what I sought to prove. So yeah, I could have done a lot more. They were the easiest. Yeah.
So you mentioned how your project is the association between crises and the aviation performance, and after the research you done into the surrounding macroeconomic environment and how it can affect the industry's performance as well. And do you have any insight into what the relationship between the macroeconomic environment and aerospace performance might look like?
Yeah, I'll try and shed some light on that. So as I mentioned, fuel costs are a significant factor of how the industry is going to perform, because fuel is used in almost everything, whether it's from the actual launch of the rocket or the airplane to the shipping of the parts on barges or aircraft. Another thing that I've noticed is consumer confidence, and so during 9/11, directly after 9/11, consumer confidence in the airline industry dropped significantly because of the fact that a terrorist attack occurred on an airplane. And so, if consumer confidence is low, this means that they're less willing to use that industry to satisfy their needs, and so this can also result in. There's a lot of other things, but those are. Okay.
You said that the shipping portion of travel was artificially inflated, and you said that was going to last for 5 years.
Yes.
Am I remembering correctly? So how did you come up with that number?
So IBM actually did a research project on the impact of COVID-19 on aerospace shipping. And what they found was that the presence of the pandemic and it's functioned as a catalyst for innovation, and it's caused consumers to spend more time and money online. It's actually fast forwarded the transition from shopping in person to e-commerce by about 5 years. So that's where I got that from. And they said that it was going to last also for about 5 years. It's in the IBM report. That's where I pulled the data from. As to why that's the case, it would be that there's, again, decreased consumer confidence, and people are less willing to go out and actually buy products in the store. And
so I guess my real question is, they don't think this is a permanent change. They think it really will revert back to.
So they think demand is going to revert back. That's what I attempted to say.
Yeah.
That demand is going to come back down, but that this trend is going to continue for the next 5 years while people are still, using Amazon.
Gotcha. Okay.
For getting
That's
their
really
groceries
interesting.
quicker.
Yeah. Great job. Yeah. Really interesting.
Okay, so that's all the time we're going to have for questions. So, we'd like to ask you to join us after these in the dining commons for a short reception, where we'll be able to enjoy some soup treats that our DSP community has offered. And the scholars will also be available there for if you have any more questions you'd like to talk to them about. But before we go and enjoy our reception, we'd like to invite Dr. Gross to come down to the stage. This one to thank her for all the work that she's done in making these presentations possible.
Go to my house to die. I have never had any luck with work. These are beautiful. I'll do my best. Thank you so much. I'm so proud of you all.
We just wanted to take a second to recognize Dr. Rose because she's been incredible, and this is her first year teaching this particular program. She was in college before, so it's a lot different for her, but she's really been phenomenal, and we're really grateful for all her contributions. We could not have gotten to this point without her. So we wanted to take a couple moments to recognize her contributions.
Again, on behalf of the entire Distinguished Scholars Program, we'd like to thank you for, you've been here for only a year, but the contributions you've made to this program and its curriculum have been substantial. And thank God you made the transition from college to high school students, because I've heard that they've been a little more, they listen to you a little more. But again, I'd like to thank you for everything you've done.
All right. I'd like to thank you also for all that you have done to accommodate different avenues of research. Getting to research this topic has been extremely interesting, and you have, occasionally fulfilling. So I definitely appreciate all that we've learned from you. Thank you.
before we go to the tiny comments to enjoy the views and grinds that we have waiting for us, I'd like to close with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for tonight and the presentations that the seniors have just given to us. Thank you for bringing this audience together to hear and learn from these scholars. And as the senior scholars graduate from the DSP program, please bless their lives and guide them to seek your will and follow your path as they move on to college. We're so incredibly proud of them, and we're sure that you have great things on them. And please put your hand over the entire DSP program as we finish up this year and move on to the next, guiding the younger scholars as we begin the research that leads to these senior recognitions. Please bless everyone who has come tonight and help this community to support DSP. These presentations will be possible. And lastly, please bless us all and keep us all safe as we go. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Everyone, please give that one when we go up. And thank you all again so much for coming.